In life, when we notice a problem with our friends, even though we know it's wrong, we often choose to hold our tongues. What is behind the concerns about exposing their shortcomings and embarrassing them? Does this kind of behavior benefit people or hurt them? Watch the Christian testimony video, "Does a Good Friend Look the Other Way?" to find out.
Sister Barbara and I had known each other for 2 years, and we had built up quite a rapport. Every time we chatted, it felt like we could go on forever. We'd often talk about each of our experiences and what we'd gained from them. When something happened to her, she'd come find me. And when I had a problem, I wanted to fellowship with her. She always fellowshipped with me patiently. And I cherished this close relationship that we had. I felt that it was great to have a sister by my side who could help and support me. Last year, I inadvertently heard Barbara chatting with some sisters about the great results she'd been getting in her gospel work. How many she was preaching to had religious notions, and then through prayer and reliance on God, fellowshipping and reading them God's word, they quickly came to accept God's last day's work. I saw the sisters looking at her with admiration after hearing that, circling her with all kinds of questions, seeking good paths of practice. I felt a little concerned and thought, it's good that her gospel work is going so well, but she only talked about how great her results were, not about the specific path she took, nor did she testify to how God guided her in this time. Isn't she just showing off by talking like this? A few days later, Sister Faye said to me, "Barbara is just so talented. In her gospel work, she's already achieved results." She said a leader even called on her to fellowship her experiences at a gathering. My heart jolted when I heard her say this. Why is Barbara saying these things? Faye admires her so much now, but this isn't beneficial to her.
Yeah.
I realized that Barbara was always showing off the good results she'd obtained performing her duty. And I felt kind of uneasy. God has fellowshipped that showing off is a revelation of a satanic disposition, so it would be dangerous to keep doing that.
Yeah.
This had to stop. I had to find a chance to point this out to Barbara. But whenever I thought about pointing this problem out to her, I would hesitate. I recalled experiences from years before. My partner, Janie, would reel off doctrines, chiding others from a high position, but she'd never analyze or know herself. I pointed out this problem to her, but she wouldn't accept it, and just hit back by bringing up my past failures and transgressions. Afterwards, she'd barely even acknowledge me. This made things awkward and painful for me. On another occasion, Sister Roxana went off topic in her fellowship, and I pointed this out to her. Later, she opened up to me and said she'd felt really embarrassed and resistant when I pointed it out. It made her feel uncomfortable, like I was purposely making it difficult for her, and she didn't want to fellowship at later gatherings. Though she went on to seek, reflect on, and even recognize her problems, hearing her say this was really difficult for me. After this, I felt very wary of pointing out others' problems. I thought about the great relationship I'd had with Barbara, and wondered if I'd pointed out her problem to her, would she feel backed into an uncomfortable position? What would I do if she wouldn't listen and became prejudiced against me, thinking I was trying to expose her and make things hard for her, and then refused to acknowledge me? We crossed paths a lot of times every day, so things would be so awkward. She also hadn't always shown off like this. Maybe by reading God's word, she'd reflect and come to this realization. Never mind then. I'd just keep quiet.
But then, it would be hard for her to recognize her problem.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Sometimes when we point out others' mistakes, we don't make any headway. Maybe this is because our words lack wisdom, or because we miss the key point. But we can't let our past failures stop us from pointing out issues.
Right.
Yeah.
One day, Barbara told me that brothers and sisters had made suggestions to her. They said that she liked showing off and making others admire her in her fellowship. This made her uncomfortable. I was twisted up inside hearing her say this. The truth of the matter was that I had also seen her showing off lately. But because I was afraid of hurting our relationship, I'd turned a blind eye and said nothing to her. Wasn't this the perfect opportunity? Shouldn't I also speak out about the problems I'd seen?
Yeah.
But I thought about how things were already hard for her. If I also spoke up, she might not be able to take it and become negative.
Barbara seeking you out must have meant she didn't really understand her problem. Speaking up would have really helped her.
Yeah. I realized, too, that I had to point out the problems I had seen to her. But I worried she'd think I was being harsh and distance herself from me. So I thought carefully about what tone of voice to use and how to express myself to be more tactful and not make her feel embarrassed. So I just brought up examples of how I'd exalted myself and showed off in the past, and how I'd reflected on it and come to understand, and at the end, I briefly touched on her problem. I was afraid of embarrassing her and tried consoling her, saying, "Everyone has corrupt dispositions, and it's perfectly normal to show that. I do it too. I've always been very arrogant and conceited, and I often show off. Don't let it constrain you. Have the right attitude towards yourself." She said nothing in response to this. But then something happened that made me feel unsettled again. At one gathering, Barbara was fellowshipping on her understanding of God's Word and went on to talk of a recent experience she'd had in spreading the gospel. She said she'd been preaching to a pastor who had believed in the Lord for decades. He had many religious notions and had listened to lots of rumors. He still wouldn't accept the gospel that was preached to him repeatedly, but she'd gone to fellowship and debate with him, and by finding relevant passages of God's Word, she'd refuted his notions. Eventually, he gradually let go of his notions and accepted God's new work. When she finished speaking, everyone's attention was drawn to her gospel experience and away from God's Word. At the time, I was a little aware. Isn't this going off topic? Though she was fellowshipping about her gospel experience, when she'd finished, everyone was admiring her and looking up to her. Isn't this her just showing off? I wanted to point this out to her and have her stop talking about that, but I just couldn't get the words out. If I interrupt her in front of this many people, won't she be really embarrassed? It was true that Barbara had gotten some results in her gospel work. So if I point it out, will everyone think I'm jealous and intentionally making things difficult for her? Maybe her intentions are good and she's not trying to show off? So I didn't speak up. But I couldn't calm myself down enough to ponder God's Word. And my fellowship was unenlightened as I just gave a few uninspired words. And so the gathering came to a close. I spent that evening tossing and turning in bed, unable to sleep. I just couldn't stop thinking about the things that Barbara had said to show off in the gathering, and about the looks of admiration on everyone's faces. What she had fellowshipped hadn't helped others understand God's Word better. Rather, she had drawn everyone's attention to her gospel work. So the gathering had not achieved anything good. Fearing embarrassing her, I had said nothing and failed to protect church life. Wasn't I being a people pleaser with no sense of justice? I recalled a passage of God's Word.
Oh.
Examine yourself carefully to see if you're a correct person. Are your goals and intentions made with me in mind? Are all your words and actions said and done in my presence? I examine all of your thoughts and ideas. Do you not feel guilty? Do you think next time you can make up for the eating and drinking Satan has stolen this time? Now you see it clearly. Can you compensate for this? Can you make up for the time lost? You must diligently examine yourselves to see why no eating and drinking was done in the past few meetings and who caused this trouble. You must fellowship one by one until it is clear. If such a person is not strongly constrained, your brothers and sisters won't understand, and then it will happen again. Your spiritual eyes are closed. Too many of you are blind, and those who do see are careless about it. They don't stand and speak up. They, too, are blind. Those who see but do not speak up are mute. There are many here with handicaps. Amen.
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 God's word deeply distressed me. I thought about how Barbara had gone off topic in her fellowship, wasted everyone's time, and impacted our gathering. And I just looked on silently. I kept thinking to myself, I clearly knew that Barbara was going off topic. So why did I not protect church life? Why did I choose to remain silent? Firstly, I was uncertain as to whether Barbara's actions were her exalting herself and showing off. It was true she had some experience in spreading the gospel, and fellowshipping these experiences could be beneficial to others. So could her fellowshipping like this be considered showing off? Secondly, I worried I wasn't seeing clearly that my speaking up would constrain her, and that the others will think I was saying these things out of jealousy.
So how did you resolve this problem?
At the gathering the next day, I brought up my worries and sought help from a few sisters. We read a passage of God's Word. Exalting, testifying to, flaunting themselves, working for others' regard. Corrupt mankind is capable of these things. This is man's instinctive reaction when ruled by their satanic natures, and it is common to all corrupt mankind. How do people usually exalt and testify to themselves? How do they achieve this aim? They testify to the amount of their work and their suffering, their great efforts, and what price they have paid. They use this as capital to exalt themselves for a higher, firmer, stabler place in people's minds, so that more people will esteem, admire, respect, and even venerate, idolize, and follow them. To achieve this aim, people do many things that testify to God on the surface, but essentially exalt and testify to themselves. Is acting that way reasonable? They are beyond the purview of rationality. They have no shame. They unabashedly testify to what they have done for God and how much they have suffered for Him. They even flaunt their gifts, their talents, experience, special skills, clever modes of conduct, means to toy with people, and so on. They show off and belittle others to exalt and testify to themselves. They also dissemble and camouflage themselves, hiding their weaknesses, shortcomings, and deficiencies from people, so that the only thing they can ever see is their brilliance. They dare not share when they feel negative or open up in fellowship with others. They do their utmost to conceal any mistakes they make. Never do they mention the harm they have caused to the church's work in the course of doing their duty. But when they've made some minor contribution or achieved some small success, they are quick to show it off. They just simply cannot wait to let the whole world know how capable they are, how high their caliber is. how exceptional they are, how much better than average they are. Is this not a way of exalting and testifying to themselves? Amen.
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 Through the revelation of God's word, I understood that one sign of Antichrists exalting themselves is their flaunting of their gifts, their strengths, contributions, and achievements before others to make people think they're talented and capable and gain their respect and admiration.
Yeah.
Right.
Spreading the gospel and testifying to God are positive things, with her strengths as a gospel worker. If Barbara had fellowshipped on the difficulties she'd faced, how she then relied on God and experienced his work, what she had gained and learned from this, and the good paths of practice she summed up, that fellowship would have been edifying.
Yeah.
But Barbara only talked about how many people she had converted, how much she'd suffered, the price she'd paid. But no one listening to her gained any greater understanding of God or any clarity on how to practice or approach different issues. Instead, they just learned more about her and knew that she had gifts and caliber in sharing the gospel and was more ardent than others. Everyone praised and envied her and, in turn, felt deeply inadequate. I saw that the results of showing off and exalting and testifying to God were not the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. In preaching the gospel, you'll encounter many issues and can become negative and weak. If you avoid talking about this and only speak about how you've suffered and what you've achieved doing your duty, you're liable to mislead people and make them admire you.
Yeah. Through fellowshipping, my previous views were confirmed. And I determined that most of what Barbara said wasn't testifying God, and rather was said to show off. She revealed an Antichrist's disposition, which would incur God's disgust. The sisters also reminded me that actually Barbara may not yet be aware of the corrupt disposition she was revealing, and that having seen this, we should lovingly point this out to her. We couldn't be people-pleasers just to protect our relationships. The sisters' words filled me with shame, and I decided to fellowship with Barbara as soon as possible. After the meeting, I just couldn't calm myself down. I had seen Barbara's issues before, but not dared to point them out to her. And when I did say something, I skimmed over the problem without achieving anything, meaning Barbara never truly reflected on or became aware of her problem. I was filled with unease and guilt at these thoughts, and I asked myself, I'm normally so cheerful around Barbara and tell her everything. So why am I finding it so hard to point out her problems? Why can't I get the words out? In searching and reflecting, I read God's word.
Almighty God says, "You are all well educated. You all pay attention to being refined and understated in your speech, as well as to the manner in which you speak. You are tactful and have learned not to do damage to the self-respect and dignity of others. In your words and actions, you leave people room to maneuver. You do everything you can to put people at ease. You do not expose their scars or shortcomings, and you try not to hurt them or embarrass them. Such is the principle by which most people act. And what kind of principle is this? It is conniving, slippery, treacherous, and insidious. Hidden behind people's smiling faces are a lot of malicious, insidious, and despicable things. All those who stick to the middle ground are the most sinister. They try not to offend anyone. They are people pleasers. They go along with things, and no one can see through them. A person like that is a living Satan. There is a tenet in Philosophies for Living that says, keeping silent on the faults of good friends makes for a long and good friendship. It means that in order to preserve a friendly relationship, one must keep silent about their friends' problems, even if they see them clearly. That they should uphold the principles of not attacking the other's dignity or exposing their deficiencies. They are to deceive each other, hide from each other, engage in intrigue with each other. And though they know with crystal clarity what sort of person the other is, they do not say it outright, but employ cunning methods to preserve their friendly relationships. Why would one want to preserve such relationships? It is about not wanting to make enemies in this society, within the group, which would mean subjecting oneself often to dangerous situations. As you do not know in what way someone will harm you after you have exposed their faults or hurt them, and they become your enemy, and do not wish to put yourself in such a position, you employ the tenet of Philosophies for Living that runs, never hit below the belt, and never call others up short. In light of this, if two people are in such a relationship, do they count as true friends? They are not true friends, much less are they each other's confidant. So, what sort of relationship is this exactly? Is it not a fundamental social relationship? In such social relationships, people cannot offer their feelings, nor have deep exchanges, nor say anything they like, nor say out loud what is in their heart, or the problems they see in the other, or words that would benefit the other. Instead, they choose nice-sounding words so as not to hurt the other. They do not wish to make enemies. The goal of this is to keep the people around oneself from posing a threat. When no one is threatening to them, are they not living in relative ease and peace? Is this not people's goal in promoting the phrase, never hit below the belt, and never call others up short? Clearly, this is a cunning, deceptive way of existence, with an element of defensiveness, and whose goal is self-preservation. People who live like this have no confidants, no close friends with whom they can say anything at all. They are defensive with each other, and calculating, and strategic, each taking what they need from the relationship. Is this not so? At its root, the goal of never hit below the belt and never call others up short is to keep from offending others and making enemies, to protect oneself by not causing hurt to anyone. It is a technique and method adopted to keep oneself from being hurt. Looking at these several facets of essence, is the demand made of people's virtue to never hit below the belt and never call others up short a noble tenet? Is it positive? Then what is it teaching people? That you should not upset or hurt anyone. Otherwise, you are the one who will end up getting hurt. And also, that you should not trust anyone. If you hurt any one of your good friends, the friendship will quietly start to change. They will go from being your good, close friend to a stranger passing by on the street, or your enemy. So, what is the end result accomplished by what this phrase teaches people? Does it make people more honest or more deceitful? It results in people becoming more deceitful. People's hearts grow farther apart. The distance between people widens, and people's relationships become complicated. It is equivalent to people's social relationships becoming complicated. People's dialogue begins to fizzle, and it causes a mindset of guarding oneself against each other. Can people's relationships be normal this way? Will the social climate improve? So that's why the phrase "never hit below the belt" and "never call others up short" is obviously wrong. Teaching people this way cannot make them live out normal humanity. Moreover, it cannot make people honest, upright, or candid. It absolutely cannot achieve a positive effect.
Amen.
Amen.
By reading God's Word, I saw I relied on satanic philosophies in how I interacted with Barbara, such as keeping silent on the faults of good friends makes for a long and good friendship. Never hit people below the belt, and one more friend means one more path. Until that point, I thought of these philosophies as principles by which to interact with people. I had thought that behaving like this was the only way to maintain personal relations, not to offend others, and not to create trouble for myself. Through the revelation of God's Word, I saw that these philosophies were sly, deceptive, and treacherous ways to live. That they made people guarded against one another and prevented sincere interaction or love of one another. Though interacting this way avoids offending or creating trouble for yourself, it prevents you from making true friends and only allows people to become more fake and deceptive.
Yeah.
That's right.
I also came to understand that one should be candid when interacting with others. And when you see someone has a problem, you should rely on compassion to help as best you can. Even if in the moment they can't accept it and misunderstand you, you still must adhere to those principles when approaching them.
Indeed.
That's right. That's a true friend, a true brother or sister.
Definitely.
Those who genuinely accept the truth when they're dealt with, though they may feel embarrassed and unaccepting, they can later seek the truth and reflect on themselves. Not only will they not begrudge others, rather they will be grateful.
That's right. I thought back on my interactions with Barbara. Several times I'd clearly seen her showing off in front of others, and that the others thought very highly of her. But I was afraid I'd wound her ego and that she'd disregard me. So, in order to keep on good terms with her, I didn't help her or say anything as she revealed corruption, which meant that she was not reflecting on and did not know her problem, and later went back to her old ways. I saw that, living by these satanic philosophies, I had only wanted to protect our relationship, for Barbara to say I was understanding and empathetic. I had not considered her life entry at all. If only I had pointed out the problems I had seen to her sooner, maybe she would have had some understanding of her corruption and wouldn't say such unreasonable things during gatherings. I had become a people pleaser to protect our relationship. This was harmful behavior.
Yeah.
I then thought of another sister I had interacted with. I saw she was often perfunctory in her duty, and when her problems were pointed out to her, she'd argue and not accept it. I had wanted to fellowship with her to help her, but I felt that she was quite old, and if I pointed out her problem, I'd hurt her ego. and make her think of me as overly harsh. So then I just turned a blind eye to her problem, pretending not to see it, and remained outwardly cheerful, chatty, and friendly with her. It was only after she was dismissed for being perfunctory in her duty that I regretted not helping her sooner. It was only after she left that I fellowshipped the problems I had seen with her. Though she had come to recognize her problem, she reproached me for not pointing it out to her sooner, and said if she'd mended her ways, she may not have been dismissed. At this thought, I finally saw that living by these philosophies and being a people pleaser isn't being a genuinely good person. It doesn't show sincerity or compassion toward others. Instead, it's selfish and deceitful. I was living out a satanic disposition and disgusting God.
Yeah.
Barbara had always been so sincere with me. But I'd relied on these philosophies with her and not practiced the truth. I'd only considered how not to offend her and to preserve my good image. And when I saw her revealing corruption, I disregarded it. Was I a good friend while acting like this? I saw that keeping silent on the faults of good friends makes for a long and good friendship was a lie of Satan, and I no longer wanted to live by it.
Yeah.
In my reflection, I realized that there was another reason as to why I didn't point out her problem. I was holding a mistaken view. I'd always thought that pointing out someone's problems was exposing their flaws, and that it would hurt their ego, likely offending them, and that it was a thankless act. So with Barbara, I always feared that she'd be offended if I pointed out her problem and that it would ruin our relationship, which made it hard to practice the truth. So I sought God, asking him to guide me in resolving this problem of mine. In my search, I read these words of God.
Almighty God says, God demands that people tell the truth, say what they think, and not trick, make fun of, mislead, satirize, insult, constrict, hurt, expose people's weaknesses, or mock people. Are these not the principles of speech? What does it mean to say one should not expose people's weaknesses? It means not to get dirt on other people. Do not hold on to their past mistakes or shortcomings in order to judge or condemn them. This is the least you should do. On the proactive side, how is constructive speech expressed? It is mainly encouraging, orienting, guiding, exhorting, understanding, and comforting. Also, sometimes it is necessary to point out and criticize others' shortcomings, deficiencies, and faults directly. This is of great benefit to people. It is a real help to them, and it is constructive for them, is it not? And what, in sum, is the principle behind speaking? It is this: say what's in your heart, and speak of your true experiences and what you really think. These words are the most beneficial to people. They provide for people. They help them. They are positive. Refuse to say those fake words, those words that do not benefit or edify people. This will avoid harming them or tripping them up, plunging them into negativity and having a negative effect. You must say positive things. You must strive to help people as much as you can, to benefit them, to provide to them, to produce in them true faith in God. And you must allow people to be helped and to gain much, from your experiences of God's words and the way you solve problems, and to be able to understand the path of experiencing the work of God and entering the reality of the truth, allowing them to enter into life and making their life grow, which is all the effect of your words having principles and being edifying to people. If you have a good relationship with a brother or sister, and they ask you to point out what is wrong with them, how should you do it? This relates to what approach you take to the matter. According to the principle of the truth, then, how should you approach this matter? What action accords with the truth? How many relevant principles are there? Firstly, at the very least, do not cause others to stumble. You must first consider the other's weaknesses and what way of speaking with them will not cause them to stumble. This is the very least that ought to be considered. Next, if you know they are someone who truly believes in God and can accept the truth, then when you notice they have a problem, you should take the initiative to help them. If you do nothing and laugh at them, this constitutes hurting and harming them. Someone who does so has no conscience or sense, and they have no love for others. Those who have a bit of conscience and sense cannot just look at their brothers and sisters as a joke. They should think of different ways to help them resolve their problem. They should let the person understand what happened and where their mistake was. Whether they can repent is their own matter. We will have lived up to our responsibility. Even if they do not repent now, sooner or later there will be a day when they come to their senses, and they will not blame you or accuse you. At the least, how you treat your brothers and sisters cannot be below the standards of conscience and reason. Do not indebt yourself to others. Help them to the extent you can. This is what people should do. People who can treat their brothers and sisters with love and in accordance with the principles of truth are the best kind of people. They are also the most kind-hearted. Of course, true brothers and sisters are those people who can accept and practice the truth. If a person only believes in God to eat their fill of bread or to receive blessings, but does not accept the truth, then they are not a brother or sister. You must treat true brothers and sisters according to the principles of truth. No matter how they believe in God or what path they are on, you should help them in the spirit of love. What is the minimum effect one should achieve? First, it is not causing them to stumble and not letting them become negative. Second, it is helping them and making them come back off of the wrong path. And third, it is making them understand the truth and choose the right path. These three sorts of effect can only be achieved by helping them in the spirit of love. If you do not have true love, you cannot achieve these three sorts of effect, and you could only achieve one or two at best. These three sorts of effect are also the three principles for helping others. You know these three principles and have a handle on them, but how are they actually enacted? Do you truly understand the other's difficulty? Is this not another problem? You must also think, what is the origin of their difficulty? Am I capable of helping them? If my stature is too small, and I cannot solve their problem, and I speak carelessly, I may point them onto the wrong path. Beyond that, how capable is this person of understanding the truth, and what is their caliber? Are they opinionated? Do they understand spiritual matters? Can they accept the truth? Do they pursue the truth? If they see that I am more capable than them, and I fellowship with them, will jealousy or negativity arise in them? These questions must all be considered. After you have considered and gained clarity on these questions, go fellowship with that person. Read several passages of God's words that apply to their problem, and enable them to understand the truth in God's words and find the path to practice. Then the problem will be solved, and they will get out of hardship. Is this a simple matter? This is no simple matter. If you do not understand the truth, no matter how much you say, it will be of no use. If you understand the truth, they can be enlightened and benefited with a few sentences.
Amen.
Amen.
From God's word, I understood that if you're exposing a person's problems to prey on their weaknesses to judge them, and if your intentions are to ridicule, mock, and denounce them, then this disgusts God. But if you point out a person's problems and shortcomings with the intention of helping them, then this is edifying. It's an expression of compassion and a sense of responsibility for their lives.
Yeah.
That's right.
If the person pursues the truth, then with the help of others, they'll reflect on themselves and seek the truth to resolve their problems, and they'll make progress in their life entry. However, some people are resistant to being dealt with and having their issues pointed out. This shows that they don't accept the truth and that they're sick of the truth. I saw that I had believed pointing out problems was exposing others' shortcomings and that it was a thankless task. This view was completely mistaken. I also came to understand there are principles to pointing out others' problems. It's not only about having good intentions or pointing out people's problems to them directly, no matter who they are. Sometimes you'll need to use wisdom, follow the principles of the truth. What's most important is that you consider the relevant truths, that you help others understand the truth and God's will by pointing things out to them, and that you give them a path of practice. Only by doing this are you helping.
Yeah.
I had finally realized that I had bad results when pointing out others' problems before, because I hadn't been seeking the principles of the truth. Just like with Roxana, who was vain, and who hadn't been dealt with before. When I found out she went off topic in her fellowship, not only should I have pointed that out to her, I should have also shared with her the principles on fellowshipping God's word, to help her find a path of practice. This would have avoided constraining her and enabled her to fellowship according to principles.
Yeah.
Your fellowship has made it clear to me that compassionately pointing out a person's problems is a good thing. But without principles, this is liable to backfire and not achieve good results.
That's
Yeah.
right. When I understood this principle, I was no longer afraid to point out Barbara's problems, and knew I should help her according to the principles with compassion to prevent her taking the wrong path. In my heart, I sought and prayed to God, how can I fellowship with Barbara effectively? Not constrain her and also allow her to understand this aspect of the truth and recognize her problem. Whenever I had the time, I'd ponder this problem. Seek out and consider God's words, which expose those who show off and exalt themselves. I looked for a chance to open up to Barbara in fellowship, to talk to her about her problems I'd noticed during this time, as well as to fellowship with her on the consequences of showing off and on God's attitude toward this kind of behavior. After our fellowship, Barbara realized the seriousness of her problem, that she was controlled by an obsession with status, that she liked having a place in people's hearts and admiration, and that this kind of pursuit disgusts God. She later went on to analyze and open up about this behavior of hers at a gathering, helping everyone recognize it.
That's great.
Yeah. Seeing that Barbara was able to reflect on and recognize her problem and hate herself, I felt very happy. But at the same time, I felt guilty. I regretted that it had taken me this long to point this out to her. She didn't become prejudiced towards me because I pointed out and exposed her problem. Nor did our relationship break down. Instead, we became closer. I understood that only by living by God's word and interacting with people according to principles can one feel a sense of peace. Thank God.
Thank God.
Thank God.